So this video is a tutorial for my specific pattern, but you guys could really use any pattern for this video because a lot of these techniques are universal when it comes to collared button-down shirts. But if you can't find one as good as mine, just click the link in the description below to go to my Etsy shop and purchase the pattern, and you can just print it off right at home. Let's get started. So after you cut out your fabric, we're going to start by sewing the yoke to the two front pieces. So first, you're going to take one of the yoke pieces and pin both shoulders of the yoke to the two shoulders of the two front pieces. Then you're going to flip it over and take the other yoke piece and do the same exact thing so that the two front pieces are essentially sandwiched in between the two yoke pieces. After you're done pinning, you're then going to sew a 1/2 inch wide seam across both shoulders, and then you're going to press it with your iron. Do not skip pressing, especially if you're a beginner. It's going to make your project look professional and clean. Now, almost every seam on this shirt is actually a French seam, but the exception is going to be the yoke because those raw edges are automatically encased between those two yoke pieces, so you don't have to worry about finishing any of those raw edges. But if you want, you can also finish all of the raw edges with a serger. It's just not going to look as nice. So as you can see in this video, those two yoke pieces are sandwiching all of the raw edges of the shoulders, and it looks super clean and nice. Now on to step 2, which is sewing that box pleat on center back. What you're going to do is flip your shirt around so that you're looking at the wrong side, and you're going to take those dots that you transferred from the pattern and bring them to center back so that the yoke is the same length as the back piece. Next, you're going to stitch that down just 1/4 inch from the edge so that it stays in place when you attach it to the back yoke. Now, this part is going to be the hardest, so if you can get through this, you can do anything, and the rest of this sewing project is downhill. What you're going to do is flip the back of the shirt so that right sides are together on that yoke piece, and you're going to pin it down to just one of the yoke pieces. Don't pin it through both yoke pieces, okay? It's also very important that you're pinning it to the right side of that front piece that you've already constructed. So if you're a beginner, please choose fabric that you can easily tell the front from the back, because that's going to help you a lot. As you can see here, I only pinned it through one of the yoke pieces, okay? Now, oftentimes this is referred to as the sausage roll because the two yoke pieces are kind of like the buns, and then the front and back pieces are rolled tightly into this sausage shape so that you can flip the other side of that yoke piece around the back and pin it to the other side of the yoke piece, sandwiching in that back piece. This is the best way, in my opinion. So once you're done pinning that, you're also going to sew a 1/2 inch seam away from the edge, and just make sure you're not catching those two rolls of fabric inside of your yoke. Take it slow and take your time and just sew through those 3 pieces. Now, if you're not confident you did it correctly, I would just sew a basting stitch so that you can check your work and unpick it quickly and easily. This step may be very frustrating for some of you, but just stay strong and keep going because it does get easier, I promise. And now the most satisfying part is flipping it inside out through that neck hole, and you'll really start to see it come together and it will start looking like an actual shirt. And this is how it should look when it's all laid out on the wrong side. And if you flip it over, this is how it should look on the right side with that box pleat, and it's gonna look super clean and professional. For this next step, you're going to be sewing the side seams of the front and back pieces together, and what I recommend is doing a French seam. To do a French seam, you're actually going to put wrong sides together first, so 1/4 inch from the sides, trim it down 1/8 inch, press it so that it's nice and crisp and clean, and then you're going to be flipping it so that right sides are together and sewing another 1/4 inch seam from the edge, encasing those raw edges. Now, if you're not doing a French seam, make sure you're sewing those two pieces together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and either doing a zigzag stitch to keep the edges from fraying or using a serger if you have one. And now this is what your shirt should look like after finishing step 4. Now onto step 5, which is sewing the underarms of the sleeves. Again, I recommend doing a French seam. I think it just looks the best. After you're done sewing the underarms of the sleeves, you will then attach the sleeves to the shirt. And if you're going to be doing a French seam, again, you're going to put wrong sides together first. Sew 1/4 inch from the edge, trim it down, flip it, press it, and then do another 1/4 inch seam away from the edge, encasing those raw edges. You really shouldn't have to ease that sleeve in at all, but if you have a loose weave fabric, you may have to do a basting stitch around that cap to make it fit into that armhole. But keep in mind, if you're a beginner, the sleeve should not have any gathers or puckers. Next, you're going to iron that interfacing on the collar piece, the collar stand, and also where the buttons and the buttonholes go on those 2 front pieces. Next, for step 7, you're going to sew the 2 collar pieces together, 1/4 inch from the edge, but keeping that round curved part of the collar open, because that's the part that we are going to attach to the collar stand. And then around the entire collar, I want you to trim it down, and at the corners, you're going to just kind of trim right across so that when you flip it inside out, it's going to create really nice points. If you're using a loose weave fabric that is really prone to fraying, I want you to use a very short stitch length around those corners, and then also maybe consider doing top stitching. Top stitching is a great way to make those corners look more pointed if you have a really thick fabric. For step 8, we are going to be sandwiching the collar between the 2 collar stand pieces around that round edge. Now, I know it looks a little weird, but you do have to make sure that you're putting right sides together. And what I want you to focus on is matching those 2 end pieces of the collar stand up first, and then pinning down the center through all the pieces and working your way outwards with the pins. Now, those 2 end pieces are supposed to run off the edges, okay? You're gonna probably have about 1/2 inch running off either end because you need to have seam allowance for attaching that collar stand to the neck of the shirt. After you're done pinning, it should look like this, and then I want you to sew 1/4 inch from the edge and then trim that down to 1/8 of an inch. Again, using a shorter stitch length if you have to. And then flip that down and iron it so it looks like this. After pressing, you can top stitch through all of those layers to get it to lay nice and flat. For step 9, you are going to sew a basting stitch around the neckline of the shirt so that you can match all of those notches on the collar stand and get those end pieces on the collar stand to match the dots that you transferred from the pattern piece. For this step, you're only going to be sewing the right side of the collar stand to the right side of the back of the shirt. You're not going to be sewing through both collar stands. And then sew 1/4 inch from the edge so it looks like this. Now onto step 10, which is a little bit technical again, but I know you guys can do it. You're going to be flipping that button facing backwards so that right sides are together, and you're going to pin it to the right side of that inside collar stand. But make sure you still keep those stands separate. And then you're going to be sewing 1/4 inch from the edge just to the end of that button facing. You're not going to be sewing all the way across quite yet. So the tip of that collar stand is not necessarily going to go to that crease in the button facing. I want you to be turning that button facing back on the marks that you transferred from your pattern. But I do want you to make sure that you're catching the tip of that collar stand in the button facing so that it's not sliding out. And when you press it and turn it right sides out, it should look something like this. So you do want your button facing to be hanging off the collar stand about 1/2 inch. For this next step, you're going to be turning under that inside collar stand, aligning it with that stitch that was from the other collar stand on the inside of the shirt, and pinning it down and then top stitching. Now, up until very recently, I have always done this by hand, but my skills have developed to the point where I can confidently sew this by machine, but it's totally normal and okay to do a slip stitch or do an invisible stitch by hand, because getting this to look good on the other side can be difficult. And now finally you're at the finish line, and all you have to do now is sew the shirt hem, the sleeve hem, and then the pocket. And to do the shirt hem, I want you to do a double rolled 1/4 inch hem. And ironing this before you put it under your sewing machine is going to help you a lot. And for the bottom of that button facing, I want you to roll the entire thing all at once and then fold it back and pin it in place. And when you put it underneath your sewing machine, I want you to align it with the inside of one of your presser feet and sew it about 1/16 away from the edge so that it looks like this. Now for the sleeve hem, I want you to again turn it under 1/4 of an inch, iron it, and then I want you to roll it under 3/4 of an inch and sew it super close to the edge again. And using a seam gauge in this situation is really going to help you make it look super professional and nice, and ensure that you're catching that edge when you're sewing it 3/4 of an inch away from where the needle goes down. Now, when you're finished, it should look something like this. Now, you can decide to roll the sleeve hem up on the outside if you wish to for like a cuff look, but it's just personal preference. And now for sewing the pocket. Typically, people will just do 1 layer of fabric for a pocket, but I recommend cutting out 2 pieces from your fabric so that you can sew them together and turn them inside out and then iron it, and it looks so much better. And for the top part of the pocket, you can just turn it inside on itself instead of rolling it down like this, because a lot of times those corners end up peeking out and you can get some unraveling and it just doesn't look as nice. So just do it like this and then sew it 1/16 away from the edge all the way around to secure it, and then 3/4 of the way down from the top to secure all of those layers together. Now, when you're attaching the pocket to the shirt, you can use the guides that I included on the pattern, or you can just eyeball it and place it wherever you want, depending if you're right-handed or left-handed. And when I secure my pocket onto a shirt, I like to just do a stitch 1/16 away from the edge all the way around, of course keeping that top open so that you can actually use the pocket. And then you can also do a stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the edge so it looks like it was a double needle, but that's totally up to you, it's just personal preference. And then I would also do an anchoring stitch on the very top 2 corners just to add some extra durability. And now step 16, which is sewing the buttonholes. You can do vertical or horizontal buttonholes, it's totally up to you. Both are acceptable for dress shirts, and you can use the markings that I included on the pattern to decide where those go, or you can just make your own, it's up to you. Just make sure that when you're overlaying the 2 button facings that the collar is just kissing on the top and not super far apart or overlapping. Now step 17, which is sewing the buttons. I recommend using 1/2 inch wide buttons, but you can choose whatever you want, just make sure you adjust your buttonhole accordingly. And then for attaching the buttons to the shirt, thread your needles so that you have 2 layers of thread, and then create an anchor stitch before you sew through the button and tie a knot on the back of the button facing. And then you can decide to do an X or just those 2 lines through the buttons, depending on how many holes are in your button. I'm just doing the 2 lines. And then before you tie it off, when you're about to finish, I want you to poke your needle up underneath that button, but don't go through any of those holes, and then wrap that thread around and around the base of all those stitches and tie a couple of knots as well to create a button shank so that your button has a little bit more movement and gives it a lot more durability as well. And then poke that needle back through underneath that button to tie your final knot to secure all of those threads. And that finishes up the Jack button-down collared shirt. I hope you guys enjoyed it.